Um, we want to hear from you and questions and thoughts that you have about engagement with WIN, and specifically what questions you might have about how WIN fits in here at St. Columba's. So to help us with that, I'm very grateful to have, I'm going to call it the panel of brilliance, joining us tonight. First, we have Ledley, who will help us understand what community organizing looks like in faith-based communities. So drawing upon his experience in working with Power, which is an interfaith community organization in Philadelphia, similar to WIN, Ledley would be able to share with us how community-based organizing and advocacy impacted his parish, his parishioners, and maybe even him. Second, we have Gina Lagomarsino, who is also joining us tonight. As a vestry member and as the new co-chair to the Advocacy Council, Gina will be able to illustrate for us how community organizing not only fits into, but will actually help propel our strategic plan and where we are headed as a faith community. And finally, we have Elizabeth Vaden, who's joining us as our resident WIN specialist. Elizabeth will be able to help us understand how WIN will help us with our cornerstone initiatives. So those being our family homeless initiative, becoming an anti-racist church, and how does affordable housing meet those two in the middle. So welcome to everybody to our panel of brilliance, and some quick housekeeping notes. We are recording the session, and please feel free to utilize the chat for questions or raise your hand. I think that our group is small enough that we can probably just raise hand and have conversations. I don't know, I would like to start just because I promised this last week. Do we have any outstanding questions from last week as we have kind of digested some of the information that we heard? Perfect. So that being done, Ledley, would you mind telling us just quickly kind of the experience that you had with Power?
Yeah, thank you very much, Cami. And I do want to build from what Cami just said in terms of, I'm going to speak very briefly. I'm happy to speak in greater detail, but I want to make sure that what I'm talking about is what anybody actually wants to hear about. So I'd rather be responding to particular questions. And rather than talking just about my experience in Philadelphia with the organization called Power, I'll say that I've been involved in faith-based community organizations in every parish that I've served since beginning ministry. And most of them have been affiliates of the Industrial Areas Foundation, as WIN is. There are two main national organizations. IAF is one of them, and the other one used to be called PICO. It's now called Faith in Action. And my experience is that the working with a faith-based community organization, I've done it both on a very local level, as in Paterson, New Jersey, one of the foci was literally a couple of blocks around the church, and we organized ourselves to address issues there. There was a lot of drug dealing and prostitution going on those blocks, so there was a lot to be addressing. From the very local to very broad. And in Philadelphia, one of the issues that we took on is that the Philadelphia airport was going through a major expansion during that time. And we leveraged the process so that we could help persuade the powers that be to ensure that preference was given to contractors who were local to Philadelphia, and keeping the dollars in the region. So that was a much broader based kind of approach. Throughout my experience in each place I've been, the caliber of the local organizer and organization is varied, but for the most part, as I think those of us that were here last week experienced in Amy Bruno, the leadership is committed, smart, strategic, and working hard. And I found that the training is superb, and the general analysis has been, for me, very eye-opening. I would say, when I think about this in particular, I guess well, across the board, I'm thinking of Philadelphia, but it really was for our parish. And so the church that I was in Philadelphia was, while it was downtown Philadelphia, it was, as St. Columba's is, in a more affluent part of town, and a congregation of sort of similar educational level. And it created a means for us to develop relationships across the city and the region that were multiracial and multi-ethnic and multi-economic and multi-faith. It created a vehicle for us to be able to respond promptly to issues that came up that affected the larger city, or even things going on in the nation, so that we could say, we want to come together as people of faith and make a stand around, I don't know, the violence going on here or there. I will say, as we heard Amy and Bruno and John Moore talk about last week, that the essential ingredient of it is the individual relationship building, the one-to-one to one-to-one. And I would say that one of the huge things by building those relationships for me has been to see the opportunity of empowering people, in particular, empowering people who aren't accustomed to having power or have not been able to have access to power. So during the course of my ministry, I have met with the mayors and city council members of most of the communities where I have served. And when I do so, I make sure I got my collar on straight and I have my talking points. And I may feel a bit intimidated, but I know that I can walk into the halls of power because I'm an educated, straight white guy, and I'm used to walking into places where decisions are made. It's been much more exciting for me in the instances when I've worked with faith-based community organizations to walk into those same halls, but be there standing with a group of people who aren't used to being able to do that. Perhaps the main spokesperson addressing the city council member is a janitor by profession or a baggage handler at the Philadelphia airport, and to have them and just to be there for moral support and back them up. It's I found it very powerful. I also really appreciate knowing that these organizations are connected to a wider network, and that gives us an access to a deep bench of people who have been committed to addressing these issues effectively, not just in DC in this case, but more broadly. Most important is that it's provided me and our congregation with a way of feeling like we were really engaging with some of the larger systemic issues. While it's, as we heard discussed last week, it is important, and it's part of the strategy of community organizing to have winnable, some small winnable issues to address, they're playing the longer game and paying attention to how those small winnable issues are tied into the larger effect. I would say that the impact on the congregation for me is very tremendously depending upon the congregation that I've served in. So when I was in Paterson and in Jersey City, and to a lesser extent in Norwalk, Connecticut, the issues that we were trying to address were directly impacting the people in our congregation. So it was like we were the ones that needed to have the justice issues. In Philadelphia, it was less so, again, because we were in a place of greater privilege, and that changes the level of involvement. I think that, for us in Philadelphia, as it sounds like the experience was at St. Columba's originally, there was a smallish group that was deeply involved. And then that smallish group was able to turn out a crowd for some important actions. At our parish in Philadelphia, a lot of people weren't personally involved, but they were glad to know that their church was. So I think for us, it's like, I may not volunteer at the water ministry, but I'm really glad St. Columba's has a water ministry, for instance. And lastly, I guess one of the things that I really personally appreciate is that I'm always reminded in part of the training is that one of the things they point out is that at least among faith leaders, left to our own devices, many of us will meet with the same 20 or 25 people continually, because they're the people in church leadership, and continually being pushed to say, no, get out there and meet with other people who you don't know. And that's part of the discipline of the one-on-ones. And I'll stop there, and happy to speak more about any of it later. So I think I'm over to you, Gina.
Great, thanks. Do you want me to dive in, Cami, or take questions, or how should I?
Let's pause for a second here. And thank you for that, Ledley, and giving us an idea of what it can look like specific in a faith organization. So I want to open it up for questions, and it can either be specifically to Ledley and what it looked like or what his experience was, and or if you already have questions geared up for Gina or for Elizabeth, let's go ahead and dive into those too. So the floor is open. Yes, Sandra.
I think I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
Okay. And this question is for Ledley. In the past, as I'm sure you know, there was this core group of people. Tish Gardner was probably the biggest champion of all. And they kind of ended up feeling, I don't know, shall we say, cut off from, or estranged is not exactly the right word, but not really hooked into the congregation. They were kind of out there on their own. And then as a result of that, St. Columba's just sort of dropped out of WIN because not enough people were engaged. One of those people, I think Carolyn Sterick, said, well, it was just a handful of us middle-aged women doing this. And so how can we avoid that in the future, Ledley? I mean, look who's on this video right now, right?
Well, no, wait a minute. I see Peter, and I'm aware that Tim and Lane are here somewhere too. So
okay, good.
And I'm aware that Emily Griffin and Peter Lynch were with us last week, so they're a bunch younger.
And Rebecca Roebuck.
And Rebecca's, yeah, in that lot younger than I am anyway. That's a great question, Sandra. You too, Kirsten. I think it's a matter of continuing to do the one-on-ones. So I can't speak to exactly what happened here before. I do know that it does matter that I don't think it should philosophically, but it matters that the ordained leadership of the congregation is committed and involved. I don't know if there was a shift in the leadership between when St. Columba's joined WIN and when we moved away from WIN, or what all the issues were. I think it's a matter of reaching around. In our parish in Philadelphia, we actually found that it was some of the younger people who were most interested and most animated, because it was justice related issues, and it wasn't a set regular time commitment. It was an occasional thing. You know, can you come out for a meeting, for a gathering on this day in June? And that was often doable for people. That's not a very satisfying answer, Sandra. I think it's building the relationships one by one.
Within the parish, you mean?
Within the parish.
I mean, there's the relationship building that, goes on one-on-one out, as you start to engage with people outside of the parish, but you're talking about relationship building in the church.
It's essential, even in a very small church, to continually be doing the one-on-ones internally while you're also doing them externally, for exactly the reason that you're talking about. Because otherwise you just end up having a small handful of people. So maybe that's the actual answer to the question, is you have to keep up the practice of building the connections internally as well.
Thank you, Ludley. And I'm also going to ask Elizabeth if she has thoughts on this question as well, because as part of this process, this discovery process, if you will, we've met with several different parishes that are involved with WIN. So I'd like to hear, Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on what they have noted is helping it be successful at their parish?
Yes, and I'll also note, Rebecca, I see you too, and we'll come back to you right after this. So the issue that Ledley raised was a really important one. And WIN leadership has raised that with us as well, that having supportive clergy is a huge part of a successful program. Other things I think that have changed in this period of time, and we've been hearing this from some of the other churches we've been talking to as well, is that there really does seem to be an increased appetite for activism among our parishioners. We've seen this in small group facilitated conversations that the Anti-Racism Task Force led. We saw it in responses from people like Rebecca and others who responded to the Advocacy Council announcement. We've seen it in the response to the history forums that Stirring the Waters has presented. So there is this increased appetite that I think, that sort of thing can be cyclical, and certainly it seems to be at a high point right now. I do think too that the historical research that's been done at St. Columba's about our experience with respect to Reno City and our relationship to the old St. George's Mission Church has also really gained people's attention and interest. And I think there's a feeling of today we'd like to be on the right side of history with this. We'd like to know that when people look back at us 100 years from now, that they say those folks were doing the right thing and in the right place. And I also think that the strategic thinking that St. Columba's has been doing has also has also really pointed quite forcefully in this direction. So the Family Homelessness Initiative that was passed in 2019 specifically calls out as its fourth pillar the need for forceful advocacy in order to be able to address issues of family homelessness within our neighborhood, and that the root cause of that homelessness is the lack of affordable housing. And so, all of these things are connected. And that is where WIN really brings a lot of expertise to bear by virtue of its size, its experience, and the kinds of training it can offer us.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Rebecca.
Yeah, my question is also for Ledley, just given your experience leading churches like ours, similar sort of socioeconomic situation and educational attainment, and I suspect racial makeup as well. To what extent, I'm conscious too, and always in advocacy, just of, feelings of white saviorism and coming in as a church community to speak about issues that affect our congregation in a different way than they affect other people in the district. And just how, I know there's not like a clean answer to this question, but I just curious how whether that has been a dynamic that you've had to grapple with in the past, and, any lessons learned for us for this particular moment, and, recognizing how much the world has changed too, in terms of our national discourse on race and whatnot too. So it may be a different situation, but would love any thoughts that you have.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That actually touches on, I guess, for me, one of the most, I said earlier that it's been an experience of being in some of the most diverse contexts and relationships that I've been in. I would also say it's been very humbling and invites humility. In Philadelphia, I was in a congregation that's similar in that we were smart and resourceful, and partnering with others, found it was really important for us that we didn't actually know the answers, that we needed to listen, we needed to follow rather than lead. And for a congregation made up of people that like to lead, I think it's good for us. And frankly, particularly at this juncture in time, as many of us are thinking more about how privilege works, that feels to me like that's a huge value in and of itself. If the relationship with others is going to prompt us to say, how can I be supportive and not exercise the leadership which I'm trying to exercise? I'm going to hold back, and I'm going to follow and do what you tell me is most useful. That's not an easy thing. I might internally be resisting that and thinking, oh, well, really? Because I think I actually do know better. But maybe I know better, maybe I don't know better. But it's better for me to follow.
Thank you. Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to sort of follow up a little bit with what I think it was Rebecca was asking about. Some of us have been involved with other advocacy groups, not WIN, but there's Empower DC, as well as sort of an offshoot of that called Ward 3 Housing Justice. And one of the things that we've spent time doing is really being very mindful of the language that we use. there are so many what's often called microaggressions that you can commit on, people whose experiences of race and economic well-being are very different from ours. And so I would just suggest that as we sort of develop some group that moves forward with engaging with people outside of St. Columba's, that we do some of that training. Susan Lang actually has participated in training for Ward 3 housing justice, and she has some great language and sort of sensitivity about how to be effectively communicating with others, and not to come across as a know-it-all, and to be engaged in listening, and not to use certain types of language like ghetto, things like that actually, are really not accurate or fair. So anyway, I just thought I would put that out there, that it doesn't come naturally. It requires thought and I think some training to be effective as you do this work. So I'll be quiet then, thanks.
Thank you, Sandra.
I'd be curious if others on the call have experience with faith-based community organizing, or something that you think is similar. I don't know if that's taking us off course, Kim. I mean, if it is, I'll tell me and I'll withdraw my question. But
Well, I'm attempting to look at Kirsten there, who I know has a bit of experience.
But you're on mute.
Thanks. I'm having to do some kitchen work as I listen. But no, I really appreciated what you said, Ledley, because all the things that I brought with me to this session, you've really kind of addressed. I was one of the two co-leaders for my church's participation in an IAF affiliate in Chapel Hill. And it was truly one of the most powerful things we did, but there's the same tension and struggle that, after, when we first joined, there's a lot of excitement and a lot of participation. And after a while, it was me and Nancy. And it was really hard to sort of get people to show up, and we really needed people to show up. Our rector was great about showing up when we needed him to show up. But it was getting the broader community to stay engaged was really tough, even with some real wins that we got early on. And that was incredibly powerful to be able to look around your city and sort of see a day laborers care center in the middle of town that was making it safer for day laborers to find work and without being exploited. There are things that were real concrete wins that we could talk about, but still having to balance that with the relationship building internally that needed to be done a lot all the time. And we were like, Chapel of the Cross is very much like St. Columba's. It's a large church, it's affluent, it's well known and well respected in the middle of town with a lot of academic participation. So yeah, it's been great to see us or hear about this here, but also and realizing that our tensions weren't just the tensions that we held in process were things that you experienced in your church too, Ledley. Other things that was really key, I think, it's the ultimate allyship, really, is standing behind someone who's sharing a very personal story in a city council meeting, and you're one of like 100 people in this multiracial, multi-faith alliance, and you're not speaking for a woman who's talking about the state of her housing. You're standing behind her and helping her, supporting her while she tells her own story. And so it becomes a very different way of doing advocacy in this church, so many of us are professional advocates. I'm a professional advocate, and we think about how we charge forth with all of our expertise. And so learning to be able to sit back and let someone talk for themselves, but be standing next to them while they do it is an incredibly powerful experience.
Thanks.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Ludley.
Yeah, and Sharon, it looked like you had a hand up.
I did. As a relative newbie to the WIN concept, I remember hearing about it from Tish Gardner and Carolyn Starrick. What is the structure of their involvement, and how do they choose areas of activism, and then how do we as St. Columba's pick what areas of activism we want to join with them? I'm imagining that they're involved in all kinds of areas.
Yeah, they are. And they would do in an ongoing way, they would do, so there would be a, there is, I can't remember exactly what they call it, but there's some sort of strategic leadership team for WIN. As there is for any of these faith-based community organizations. And it would be comprised both of the professional organizers that have been hired, as well as the senior leaders that have been raised up through the ranks. So there wouldn't be a representative from every congregation, because like with WIN, there are, I don't know, 35 or 40 congregations. So it's probably 7 or 8 people. But periodically they do the sort of do a reassessment of what are the biggest issues facing, in our case, Washington today, and they'll WIN will be involved in doing some homework around that, and then say, okay, given those issues, education, housing, access to healthcare, whatever else there are, then we're going to make some strategic decisions about which of these we can work on. And they'll take into consideration a whole bunch of things. Part of it is, what's the scale? Can we get our hands around it? Can we define it effectively so that we can actually act on it? And do we have sufficient momentum or investment from our people around that particular issue? And then depending upon the capacity of the organization, by capacity, I mean how many congregations there are, they will probably decide we can do these 2 for the next 3 years, or something like that. I mean, it may be more than 2, but probably not a whole lot more than that, because otherwise you end up spreading too thin. Right. Recognizing that there can be little localized groups that are working on a targeted issue more locally. But it is a matter of raising up leaders, and in those strategic groups, there's no set path to that. It's really people that are showing up and smart and thinking strategically, and the organizers will say, okay, yep, that Sharon, she's really thinking, let's ask her to be part of the strategy team. And there, I will say that, I mean, another part of the humbling part is that the main issues that WIN, now we happen to be in a fortuitous time of alignment right now, in that one of the things that WIN is focusing on heavily is affordable housing, and right. So are we. There were times in my parish in Philadelphia where the things that our group, Power, was focused on had very little direct impact on the people in our congregation. And so the challenge, as you know, to the point that Sandra raised earlier, is, you know, how do you maintain the interest when I'm actually advocating for an issue that helps those people, but it doesn't help me directly? And that's so that's the lead organizers would be taking that into, they'd be taking that into consideration too, when they would think, okay, if we take on this issue, are we going to lose St. Peter's? And theoretically, you don't ever lose anybody, because we say we're in, if St. Columba says we're in, then we're in, and we're going to stand there with you, even if it's not our particular
Sorry.
item. That's okay. So.
Elizabeth,
Thank you.
do you have something you wanted to add on to that?
Well, I was just going to build on one point that Ledley made about local groups. So within WIN, one of the ways that Amy has described it in the past is to say, our issues are generated by our member institutions. And so, and that can begin with something, for example, like what's being done right now in Ward 3, where there's a tremendous amount of energy around affordable housing. And that can then get the broader support of the larger organization. So a lot of typically things sort of percolate up, and then the job of the strategic team is to sort of look at that and figure out what the organization broadly can do for the long term. But each of those individual groups can pursue their own things. The other thing you asked about was, how do we decide what to engage on? And as Leslie said, you kind of support the organization broadly, even when it's not sort of, an issue where you're deeply involved. But there are certainly things that that any organization like this does that are going to have a particular appeal to us. So we already mentioned affordable housing, and I think that's pretty well known. But there are two other areas where WIN is very active that people are sort of thinking about possibilities for engagement there. One is environmental justice issues. They have a greening of public housing program underway right now that our environment committee is very interested in tapping into. And then the other one is immigrant rights, which may be a potential interest to our refugee response ministry. So, there are things, and then there are things like the DC streetcar, which is an issue of keen interest to our neighbors across the river, but less directly affecting us here in Ward 3. That may be something that interest doesn't arise and doesn't end up getting actively involved in here at St. Columba's, and that's okay too. We pick our, we can also follow where the interests of our own ministries and parishioners take us, and that is okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So with we have a few more minutes here.
Yeah, I'll just give a couple thoughts. I don't have experience with a faith-based community organizing effort. I did in my younger days, spent a lot of time working with a group that was doing community organizing in Massachusetts. And I think both Kirsten and Ledley spoke very, very eloquently about that style of organizing and its benefits and the way that it empowers people. And I think that's very important. I think that, for a congregation like ours, as many people have noted, which has a fair number of, type A people or who want to be in charge, and many of whom are part of the power structure that groups like WIN are challenging. The question is always, how do you interface? How do you support it? How do you get involved? And I'm fine if we think WIN is doing good work, and I don't know that much about what they're doing. I think simply financially contributing is obviously a good thing, and it's something that we're able to do, and that's something we should do if we think they're doing good work. I think another way, though, to think about it is simply our role can be communicating to our own congregation and communicating to the people that we associate with what they are doing, to build support in that way. That can actually be, most of us don't know what's going on in a lot of DC in some of these wards. And even if we're not, I think it's hard to get a lot of people in the congregation, to sort of Sandra's point. Chances are you may just have a few that get actively involved, but you can try to use the connection to communicate what a group like WIN is doing, which can be very beneficial in and of itself. So I think we should keep things like that in mind. We may be able to make an impact on, upper class white people more than we can assist the organizers who are on the ground trying to empower, the type of people that Ledley was, describing going to City Hall with, which again, I think is incredibly important, but how do we really, intersect with that can be very challenging.
Hey, Tim, maybe just to pile on to that, I think just want to underscore, we have made this commitment to be an anti-racist church, and I think we are trying to find ways to listen around our city and our community to voices that aren't here, so we can better understand. And I think as a member of the vestry, which Tim, you and I both are, I think part of the reason there is interest, and we haven't made a formal decision yet on the vestry whether to join WIN. That's part of this consultation process. But I think part of the interest is that engagement in a group like this will help us get a window into some of the issues that are facing people that aren't members of our congregation. So I wholeheartedly agree with that, Tim, that there's two benefits. There's the benefit of what we can do to be supportive to other folks across the city, but there's a huge amount of learning and benefit for us as well, to being engaged. And for those of us who want to make progress on our understanding, like, I don't know much about the streetcar issue in Ward 7 and 8, and someone just raised it. Maybe I should know something about that. And I learned a lot from hearing Amy Bruno last week, just in some of the issues that she raised, that, the work with the Fort Benning community in Ward 7 and supporting that public housing community to try to just get the lights on the football field and make some improvements. And the work they've supported in Ward 3 as the mayor worked to try to move homeless shelters and spread them out across the whole district. So I feel like I could learn a lot from this, whether I'm the one, and I agree, whether I'm the one out there at the meeting or I'm hearing from others what the issues were. So thanks for raising that, Tim. I think that's a really important point about the benefits to all of us for our learning.
Thank you. And any final thoughts or questions? Yes, Sandra.
Yeah, let me chime in one more time here. I think it was, it was a long time ago. I think it was in 1996 that I first got involved with the St. Columba's Truesdale Educational Partnership. And that was really not right at the beginning, but it was early on. Somebody could have told me about what was going on in that program, and I would have said, oh, that's really interesting, and who are these kids and what are their stories? There's nothing like being there. There's nothing like just being there and getting to know the people, interacting with people, hearing firsthand what's going on in their lives, finding out that their parents were murdered, finding out that their family has become homeless, finding out that their grandmother's house burned down, they were living with her, and now they have to live with somebody else, and they have to change schools, and then their father's in jail, and hearing these stories firsthand from people, I can't tell you, for me, it was the most incredible education about what reality is for a huge part of this city. I mean, for me, it was literally life-altering. So I agree that the parish needs to become aware of the issues and aware of the problems. But I do think that we have to really try to get people to show up. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, everybody, for speaking of showing up. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And taking time and having questions and showing interest. And I'm happy to continue the conversation with anybody offline if you have other thoughts as we go forward. I expect Cami or others are as well, but I'm grateful.
Yes, absolutely. And if you do have further questions or thoughts, or if you want to know how to get involved, please reach out to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, would you mind putting your email in the chat for folks? And I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what next steps look like and where this is. So there was a presentation given to the vestry at the November meeting. And the vestry will be deciding on St. Columba's engagement with Wynn in the December meeting. And we'll move from there. And then there's one piece I definitely wanted to see to flag in your calendar. And that is going to be January 23rd. So I think that Ludley kind of mentioned action meetings or experiences in action meetings, and Kirsten kind of alluded to them too. January 23rd is going to be an action meeting with Wynn, and it is in Ward 3. And that is going to be at the formerly Wilson High School. And it is going to be focused around affordable housing. I have actually never been to an action event, but yeah, please, Elizabeth.
Housing and climate.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. But to give you an idea, is they're talking about the first 125 people that come will be in the gym, and then beyond that will be on Zoom. And it's a lot of energy, and I think is so important to show us that it's not a couple voices that are trying to move us in affordable housing, but there's a loud voice, many voices that join us. So January 23rd, and we will absolutely give more information as we have it. Yes, thank you, Kirsten. It's like a pep rally. I've heard that there's often like gospel singing and like bands. All right. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for our panel of brilliance.
Thanks, Cami.
Absolutely.
Cami.
Thanks, Cami. Great to see you all.
Have a nice night, everyone.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Night, everybody.